Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, BBOR is now back online. There was a little bit of a hiatus that was going on during the month of April, but it's very good to be doing these recordings again. You know, we had some things going on, personal life, and I happened to contract a case of bronchitis, so that was thrown into the mix. But now, hopefully, the uploads are going to be coming out much more regularly like they did in the past. And today, we are revisiting the case of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders going back to 1946. This is something that is going to be a very simple thing to discuss today. We did kind of an introduction to the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, and we also talked about the two prime suspects, H.B. Tennyson and Ewell Swinney. Ewell Swinney, of course, is kind of like viewed as the prime suspect, and then H.B. Tennyson, also known as Duty Tennyson, is kind of like one of the secondary suspects. I mean, like if you have a primary suspect, secondary suspect, those two guys are definitely the top two. But when we want to examine this particular case, we're dealing, with a series of murders that happened between the months of February and May 1946. This is kind of part of a series of podcast uploads that I've done on the case. So we're not going to go back and rehash all of the statements that we made. It's going to be geared toward, of course, people who are more familiar with the case so we can discuss some theories. Now, when we're examining this thing, I just have a very simple thing to put forward today. And I want to explore the possibility of a different suspect. And the reason why is, I've talked about this on this channel before, that I found that probably the best resources on YouTube about the Texarkana Moonlight Murders come to us from two guys named Jeremy Kennington and John Tennyson. And their videos are available under the YouTube channel name John Tennyson. And I was listening to a presentation from Jeremy Kennington, and he said something when he was like, I'm not saying that the Phantom Killer was Ewell Swinney. I'm not saying that it was Duty Tennyson. I'm not saying that it was either of them. It could be one, could be the other, could be neither. And I was like, what an obvious statement. I mean, what a painfully obvious statement. Yeah, it could have been this guy, it could have been that guy, it could have been neither of the two. The problem is, though, even though that statement might seem somewhat obvious, that is the only honest answer that someone can give when they're trying to examine this particular case. And I think that something about, the time frame might have something to do with it. Going back to 1946, we don't have media that is as strong that we would have in 2019. We didn't have social media back then, let alone genuine video recordings of a lot of these people. I mean, we can't exactly just go on YouTube and watch, a police interrogation video that would have taken place. So our kind of research and insight is going to be somewhat limited. But the thing that I want to explore today is the possibility of the Phantom Killer, the perpetrator of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, being a sexual predator. And this was somebody who left town and moved on to a different location. Why do I say this? Well, when it comes to something such as sexual predator behavior, it's my understanding that these are the type of guys that do not quit. It's not something where you would have, a person committing a series of murders from, February to May of one particular year. Remember, that's all we have. February, March, April, and ending in May. And then they cease. The sexual predator is rather continuous. I'm sure there are exceptions, but we've seen this with the case of Andre Chikatilo. We've seen this with the case of Fred and Rose West that we've talked about on this channel. And I was watching the film, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, and, of course, that's kind of like a fictionalized rendition of the story. And I don't want to spoil the movie, but I guess I have to spoil a little bit of it, where it's they refer to this guy as a kind of sexual predator who had a twisted imagination. And I just thought two big things there. Not thinking about Ewell Swinney at all, actually. I was thinking that Duty Tennyson was the guy who had the twisted imagination. Duty Tennyson just seems so almost bashful and imaginative. And he even wrote that in his own suicide note that you can read online when he's like, I should have been talking to people my own age instead of sitting in my room and dreaming. It's like, he definitely had the sort of imaginative side. And when I was making my upload on Duty Tennyson, that was a very big thing that I remarked when I was like, does he really meet the profile of the Phantom Killer? Does he really meet the profile of this guy who is sadistic and just hell-bent on murdering people? He seemed like such a kind of, once again, some guy that was just sort of in his own head, some guy who was just in the clouds. But then, I was going back through the film, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, and they made that comment about twisted imagination, twisted sadistic imagination, some quote like that, and I was like, well, that could be somebody like Duty Tennyson. However, there's another scene in the movie, which is like kind of near the end, where it's like the Phantom Killer gets injured in his leg, and they're asking about what happened to him because he was never caught, right? That's why we're discussing this case right now, is because it's an unsolved murder. It's an unsolved mystery. An unsolved series of murders, I should say. And there's this kind of scene about, they're showing someone walking down the street, standing on a line, who has kind of a limp, and you're led to believe that that is the Phantom Killer, and that he is still in Texarkana. Did that really happen? Are we dealing with a scenario like that? Or are we dealing with the case of somebody who stopped all murderous activity and just blended in with society, that stayed in Texarkana? Well, if you're dealing with someone who is a sexual predator, I'd say that that's very unlikely. And before you start trying to think of, someone that that's like an exception that proves the rule, wait about it, what about this guy? Just hear me out on this. It's like sexual predators have that continuous cycle of behavior. Like the way that some people just desire sexual intercourse, they desire to kill people. And yes, the television show Dexter really highlighted a lot of that, or they put that in another fictionalized thing, but it gives you kind of an explanation of a very clear way that that's done. And we've also mentioned other people, such as, Chikatilo and Fred and Rose West. They were all caught up in this. Also, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, the Boneyard Killers. Many, many examples of these sexual predators that do not stop. Therefore, if we actually are dealing with somebody who is the kind of twisted, imaginative, sexual predator, then I would say it was not Yul Sweeney. It was not Duty Tennyson. It's somebody altogether completely different. We are looking for a different suspect. And who is that person? Well, I can't even compose a name to that person yet, but what I would say is very likely that this person moved on to a different city. The police were scouring Texarkana. They had such a well-established presence that a lot of people really believe that's the reason why the killing stopped. That's the reason why the Phantom Killer was no longer doing anything in Texarkana, because of the presence of the police force. And the police, the very famous line, they even left the town slowly so that the Phantom Killer would not be alerted that now is the time to kill again. So, what does that tell us? That tells us that there's a very high chance that if we're dealing with some type of twisted, sadistic, imaginative killer, he moved on to another town. Where in America? It's going to take a little bit of time to kind of get into that particular aspect of it, if there is indeed a theory there. But that would mean that suspects like Yul Sweeney and Duty Tennyson, excuse me there, as I mentioned, just getting over that bronchitis, so I'm going to drink some water. When we're dealing with, suspects like Sweeney and Tennyson, that could very well mean that the confessions around these two guys are just completely invalid. And, a lot of things do not match up with the profiling of Duty Tennyson, even though he has the twisted imagination. For example, the famous saying, he killed himself by ingesting poison whereas the other victims were shot. And it's like, if he were indeed the Phantom Killer, why wouldn't he produce some harder evidence, some more damning evidence, such as perhaps the pistol that was used in the murders, some definitive physical evidence that could tie him to the murders. And remember, with Ewell Swinney, he never confessed to the murders himself. It was his wife that brought forward the confession, and she recanted it. So does that mean that we have a higher likelihood of dealing with somebody who is just completely different from the top two prime suspects? And if this is some guy who's getting off on killing people because of sexual aggression, that's not the type of killer that's just going to stop because it's going to be dangerous. That person's going to move on to a different town. That person isn't going to try and assimilate into society. So we're theorizing now. Remember, all theoretical. They're going to try and find a different hunting ground. And some of the other things that I would bring up to support that are, we talked about the kind of psychological profiling associated with serial killers, in the sense that I was actually some Lyndon Lafferty comments that if kind of a serial killer who is not super sadistic ceases in activity, it's very unlikely that they will kill again. It's like they kind of did it for a while. Once they've stopped, they do not start again. And I was talking about that on these recordings. Then I remembered the stuff we talked about with the sexual predators. And it's like, those guys don't stop. I mean, they keep going until they are captured. And that's what we really can see with the case of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. That might be a case that I would really like to get to on this channel. But to discuss the Boneyard killings, sexual predators function a little bit differently. And it was just, like I said, I was going through the town that dreaded sundown again, and I heard that line that they said he's a sexual predator, twisted sadistic imagination. That got me thinking a little bit about Duty Tennyson. But then I was like, wait a second, this is probably somebody completely different. Somebody from a completely different part of, someone who is in a completely different part of the country post-1946. So there are a wide variety of things that we could look at with that. Get some more water here. Alright, now, once again, I have to say that this was something that was brought to us from a listener. A listener suggested that we cover the case on this channel. So what I'm offering with the Texarkana Moonlight Murders is kind of a fresh perspective, someone who's a newcomer to the case, and someone who can kind of just put a fresh set of eyes on the whole thing, and like, what are the kind of initial feelings? I said very clearly, though, between the two prime suspects, I thought that H.B. Duty Tennyson was a little bit more credible than Ewell Swinney. I just, had that kind of gut feeling, not to mention the actual confession, and as well as the kind of remorse for the whole thing. Whereas we don't see any of that in the Ewell Swinney case because, well, Ewell Swinney couldn't express any remorse over the actions because he never confessed to them. It was his wife that did the confession. And, like that story, once you sort of start reading about Ewell Swinney, you can see that his involvement with this gets a little bit polluted, much on behalf of his wife's actions, and perhaps also the police and the attorneys influenced her behavior. And once again, I learned about that from listening to Jeremy Kennington and John Tennyson. So that just got me thinking that this really could be the work of an unidentified sexual predator. I said before, though, as we keep going through this case, we're going to talk about some of the other suspects. A German prisoner of war, maybe a different escaped convict. We can look at some different aspects of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. And we can see maybe there is kind of a different suspect altogether. But right now, I would really like to once again conclude by re-emphasizing that if this is the work of someone who is the kind of sadistic sexual predator with a twisted imagination, the likelihood that this person would just stop in May of 1946 because of a large police presence is very, very low. This would kind of be indicative of somebody who is going to move to a different town and continue a variety of these behaviors. Did this person get caught and get arrested in a different part of the country? Very possibly. Very possibly. But to learn what really happened, we're going to need a little bit more insight and examination into the whole thing. Well, thank you so much for listening to BBOR today. Black Box Online Radio is back on the air, and we're going to be talking about some more cases over the next few days. Thank you so much, and until next time.